And I want to push back a little bit as being maybe someone who's not very conservative in some ways, and try to make the liberal argument a little stronger. If you look at wages, something you didn't mention, Jason, for people with less than a high school education, men, you can cut that data several different ways, but in the last 35 years, wages are about 22% lower in real inflation adjusted terms. At least that's the best number I've seen. If you compare them to college graduates, then you're looking at a relative decline of wages much higher than that, maybe 35, 40% decline in real wages. When we look at specific occupations, one that's been studied a lot is meat and poultry processing. People who work on, not a pleasant term, the kill floor, where they do some very unpleasant things in very difficult circumstances. Those jobs, as far as we can tell, pay about 45% less today than they did in 1980. Do you think that those kinds of declines in wages play a significant role? Look, if you're coming from Oaxaca or Guatemala, $13 still might be good, or $12 to cut up dead animals in a very cold environment. But we haven't paid that kind of, well, we didn't in the 70s and even into the 60s, 70s, and into the 80s. We didn't pay that. We paid a lot more if you adjusted for inflation. Don't you think that plays some role in the decline of work? I'm not saying that I don't think some of the issues you've talked about, but don't liberals have a reasonable point? I don't think you have to be that liberal to say, well, gosh, if I were to say to you, I can't find workers for my business, and oh yeah, I pay half what I used to, but I can't find anybody. Don't you think somebody might say, well, don't you think that's part of the explanation? What do you think?
Well,
It's open to anybody. Yeah.
I'm happy to comment. But
I'll just start quickly. I mean, I did not say that I disagree necessarily. I was deliberately agnostic about a lot of these points because this is on, right? I was deliberately agnostic because I don't necessarily want to, make a stronger empirical claim than I have to in terms of, discussing the need for restricting low-skill immigration. I do think, that with wages going up, I think you certainly could see an improvement. And I would say, too, I mean, it's interesting that, Charles, when he was talking, seemed conflicted in the sense you can kind of tell that the libertarian in him does not want to be saying what he is saying, but nevertheless, it feels like that's what is needed right now. And I actually feel similar in that, when I read the stories of the natives who were complaining about the job conditions in that poultry processing plant, my own reaction was, gee, they should just get to work, and stop complaining. And that's just me. I mean, I understand other people have a different perspective. So I'm also kind of going against something of my own political ideology when I say, yeah, I do think the wage should go up if that's what's needed.
yeah, I think, we're conflating the normative with the positive here. I mean, is confounding your expectation to make more money, your reservation wage, actually cause people to drop out? Well, I think that's probably, it does. But on the other hand, is idleness better? And this goes back to our cultural attitudes. It is unfortunate that these jobs pay less. It is unfortunate that the economy changes and that, it's a moving target. It really is. But implicitly, we're expecting immigrants to do this work, and they cobble together multiple incomes, and they manage to have a cohesive life, and they look for improvement in the next generation. So, we're sort of have a double standard for immigrants and for natives. So I think that, I would say, I'm sorry. I know these jobs are not terribly attractive. They don't pay very well, but are we really committed, as Charles said, to keeping this whole raft of people idle with all of the implications and fallout from that, while the elites go on their merry way? I mean, this is really socially corrosive in all sorts of ways. And really, I think the elites at this point have just abandoned any confidence in the importance of work. They've abandoned tough love. They really feel like they don't have the standing to say to people, work is part of a dignified life. Work is what men do. And at the end of the day, you would be better off doing that than being on some form of the dole.
Well, I think that one of the major problems we face is that we live in a world and have lived in a world for the last century where one particular set of human skills have become more and more and more valuable in the marketplace. And that one peculiar set of skills goes under the label of IQ, cognitive ability, raw cognitive ability, ordinarily construed, measured with wonderful accuracy by IQ tests, as I have demonstrated at great length in another context. Nobody deserves his IQ. You don't deserve a low one, and you don't deserve a high one. To believe me, a lot of you in the room have high IQs. It's not because you studied hard at school. You were really, really lucky, and those who have low IQs were really, really unlucky. So I'm perfectly happy to give people credit for hard work. When Barack Obama said you didn't build that, I just got as angry as a whole lot of my friends got. But on this one thing, I think that as you're thinking about society, you start out by saying, gee, we do have this inequality in incomes, and it has been getting worse. And the people at the top have been really shooting up, and others haven't. And a great deal of that is because of living in a particular time when a particular skill set is the cat's pajamas in terms of making income. Under those circumstances, I am still in favor of a free market for wages. Free market for I'm afraid for all kinds of aspects of the free market. Do I feel that you are living in a market in which market forces are really at work if you have an unending supply of people who are willing to work for low wages? I don't think so. And so by cutting off, I'm going to be really curious to see what happens. You cut off new low-skill labor, because whereas it may be hard for the strawberry farmer under any circumstances to pay a wage high enough to get people to pick strawberries and continue a strawberry farm, if you are talking about the chicken processing, well, you've got a couple of things are going to happen. First place, Americans are going to continue to eat vast quantities of chicken, and we can't import it all. So we're going to have to continue to have chicken processing plants here. And yes, one of the incentives from that point will be to build machines that can do all of the jobs in processing chickens. And that incentive will be there, and that may very well be the solution to it from the point of view of those who process chickens. It also may be, it turns out, to get people to work in that kind of environment and work hard and do a good job, you got to pay $20 an hour. And that is going to mean a price of chicken that is somewhat higher than we pay now. You know what? I'm willing to pay a higher price for chicken if it turns out that the going market price, if you've cut off low-skill immigrants, is $20 an hour for people who work in chicken farms. I can live with that. I want to see a market for wages. I want to see employers free to substitute machines for workers. I am not prescribing a top-down economy. Believe me, Jason, I will defend my libertarian credentials, except that libertarian principles only work when the playing field is pretty damn fair. And I think the low-skill immigration, this is where I really, really change. I think the low-skill immigration deforms a great many of the processes that are required to make the free enterprise, free market system that I like work.
Can I just say one more thing? I
Go.
don't take you more time. I think the measure of a great society, and I do believe this, is the place it makes for the most humble among us. And I absolutely agree with Jason. There will always be low-skilled people. They will always be there, just like the poor will always be there. And by bringing in sort of fresh replacement troops, I am completely in favor of shutting down low-skilled immigration. The elites really are operating in bad faith. They are essentially saying we don't care about these people, and we are not willing to give them a fair chance, perhaps at the cost of paying higher prices. There are going to be some changes that will have to be made in society, but you know, we love the cheap labor. It's great for us, but it is not great for our society in the long term.
Well, thank you. I do want to inject one thing, since this is the kind of thing I study. Actually, the issue of how much it would affect consumer prices has kind of been studied. In agriculture, where immigrant labor makes up the largest fraction, the people who pick the fresh fruit and produce, where labor makes up the biggest. Some produce is just all mechanized now, but harvesting of certain kinds of things like head lettuce. Well, it turns out that only 6% of the consumer price at the supermarket is determined by the guy who picked it. Everything else is herbicides, pesticides, the cost of land, transportation, packaging, what have you. So in a world in which wages had to go up 50%, the implied increase in cost to consumers would be half of 3%, and that would be a one-time increase, assuming all of it got passed through to consumers. In meat and poultry processing, the percentage is assumed to be a little higher, but still only around 7 or 8%. So you could pay a worker's third or more, 40% more. Remember, here's another statistic if you care. The bottom 10% of the U.S. labor market only accounts for about 3% of the economy. Even the bottom 20% is only like 6% or 7%. Those workers at the bottom really don't make very much. And so even if wages rose a lot at the bottom end, it couldn't spike inflation very much because they don't make anything to begin with. So something to think about anyway. I will now open it up for questions, but we have a microphone. So when you ask your question, just identify yourself and ask away. So
let me first say we have copies of the study outside the room if you want a copy of Jason's study. Also, if you haven't signed in, we'd appreciate it if you did, and I'm going to start back here.
Okay.
Can you please identify yourself first?
Oh, hi, Neil Monroe. A few minor points on the question of immigrant labor. Any immigrant labor is enormously subsidized by the federal government to a colossal extent, because any person coming into the country receives a massive, massive, massive subsidy by getting a job here. It's called citizenship, and the value of citizenship is worth $1 million. So, in effect, any job for any immigrant is a colossal giveaway by the federal government. On the question of status, you mentioned the girlfriend, which is weirdly enough the example I use. We don't measure the status changes caused by immigration in lower-end workplaces or in higher-end workplaces. Do you know of any researchers who try and keep track of what the price of working with illegals is, or the price of working with immigrants does to career choices and such like?
I'm not sure I understand the question. You're asking, do people try to look at the presence of immigrants, and you're not asking whether the presence of immigrants affects labor force participation.
Let me try it again.
Yeah.
If for a young person wondering if they want to take a job, if the only choice is to work alongside illegals who dislike you,
Yes,
who don't speak your language, it creates a barrier. And there's no compensating price for overcoming this barrier, which is humiliation for yourself and in your own community. I cannot measure the scale of this, but
No, you're right. It's very difficult, right? If everybody who works at that shop speaks with an accent and you don't, is that a place that would be very welcoming to you? Those kinds of things. Yeah.
Has a story on precisely this point of rising wages among low-skilled, and said one person said, I had to work with all these people speaking Spanish. It was really hard to do that.
Right. So, no, there's anecdotal stuff, right? We all see signs at a restaurant where the sign for the job of the cook in the back is only in Spanish, right? We've seen that.
no particular research on this.
Not on that particular question, how immigration affects social status. But I could be wrong, actually. Let me think about that, because something does suggest that there's been, but there's not much. So, anyway.
Hi, excuse me, I'm Penny Starr with CNS News. Mr. Murray, I was sort of taken aback when you started out by mentioning Trump, and then with your remarks, I realized why you said you're not voting for Trump, because you brought up the issue that seems to resonate with the Americans who are supporting Trump, and maybe even the group of people you're talking about, who are idle, who are wanting the job, are the exact people who are supporting him. So how can you address the immigration problem in a different way that shows that it's, the benefit of all Americans, I guess, is my question,
That's what I tried to do. Yeah.
Okay.
I just wanted to make sure that nobody thought that I was weakening in my resolve regarding Mr. Trump.
I don't need a microphone. You do, though,
For the video
clearer
tape.
without a microphone.
but you have to be picked up by our...
For the video.
It's for the audio system. That's why you need
the audio's okay. All right. I'm blasting my own ears right now. There's an old moral principle that states that if you desire the ends, you desire the means. And so this is I'm tying on to what you said, although I'm not addressing it, because I was going to say it anyway. And so I'm addressing Charles Murray. If you desire the grand experiment, as you put it, regarding Amy Wax and a moratorium on low-skilled immigration, you can't get it if Hillary Clinton is the president. And it's either or, Trump or Hillary. So if you desire the ends of this grand experiment, then you desire the means of Donald Trump. So I don't see how you can square that circle.
It's real simple. Yeah. If Donald Trump were to adopt every jot and tittle of the thinking of Friedrich Hayek and Milton Friedman, I would not vote for him. It is possible to have a temperament and a character which makes you unfit to hold the office of President of the United States. I'm not going to argue with you about whether I am right in thinking that, but that's what I think.
Okay.
This question is directed toward Amy Wax. First of all, I've read some of your material and I admire your work, and as all of these people here. That's why I'm here today. I wanted to ask if part of the problem with lack of research, I'm a former graduate student at a couple of different universities, did a bunch of research for professors, which they happily took credit for with a short summary on top. So I didn't bother to say I can get a PhD. Then I would have been part of the problem. The point I want to raise with you is whether you think or not think, and this is just your opinion, there would be no study to show this, that part of the intellectual disengagement from the reality of the suffering of the lower class is because the professors have become part of the elite, either by emotional intellectual attachment or because they're just this. A lot of the work I did 40 years ago tied to a lot of this stuff. It's not done anymore for some reason that I don't understand. So perhaps some of it was funded by Great Society. But why is there so great a disinterest? I've been to several academic conferences in criminology, and they're just studying the stupidest stuff. And people are getting a lot of money for it. Now, some of this is recent with the Obama administration, but some of this has been going on for a long time. So just your comments about academics, professors, and are they now part of the problem? Because a lot of them do have very fine gardeners and very fine cooks and housekeepers, and they are all illegal. So,
well, they're not all illegal, but they're not paying them very much. I mean, I absolutely think that academia is, now maybe I shouldn't even use this word. It's almost a kind of cesspool. I mean, what has happened to academia is shocking. It is shocking. And, Charles has described some of the problem. There has been a kind of acceleration of this entrenchment in, what I call the narrative, this whole world view, which cannot be penetrated. Now, these people think that they have the interests of the working class at heart and that they are their great champions, so the amount of self-delusion is tremendous. But there's also been this divergence. It's mainly been education-driven. So all the people in academia are very highly educated. They're not necessarily rich, but they make enough money to live with like people and like-minded people with the same cultural orientation. Correct. And it is locked in. I will just tell a very quick anecdote. I was in the People's Republic of Stockbridge this summer visiting a friend of mine in the most upscale, lily-white neighborhood you could possibly imagine. We were at brunch. The host made the mistake of asking me what I thought would happen to Trumpism after Trump was defeated. And for some reason, I got off on how, I thought that we should have more respect for the achievements of European culture, of Western civilization. It's really responsible for all of the advances of modernity, and we should be more concerned about preserving, protecting, and defending it. I was, and I just didn't see that concern among my colleagues. Well, there was a guest there, a very well-educated woman, very fancy, and she said, I cannot listen to, she put her hands over her ears. She said, I can't hear this. I can't listen to this. I just can't, and she stormed out of the room.
in Stockbridge. That's too great.
It was astonishing.
Okay. We have another question.
Well, thank you. Craig Keller from Washington State. I just thank you for your research, Dr. Rich Wine. And what I'm thinking about throughout this is, as an economics major, but we can't quite analyze it strictly through the statistics, which you've done a terrific job with. I'd like to share that in 2011, when there was a lot of gnashing of teeth out in Washington State about how they were having to hire inmates to go pick the apples, I decided to conduct an experiment. I went for 2 weeks and picked apples. Excellent work, healthy work. It's just wonderful. It's hard, but what I want to say is there have been a lot of barriers to entry that are frustrating clearing mechanisms that we need. For example, housing requirements that have inhibited the growers from putting in housing that formerly supported retirees to come pick apples, and for that intra-America migrant labor force that used to happen from Oklahoma to Washington State or north-south. It's now become an international migration. Also, even the state-run Employment Security Office, the artificial requirement that you have to hire somebody within 50 miles of the location. So even my own state wouldn't help me. I had to procure that employment directly with the grower, because the illegal who lived within 50 miles of the orchard had a better chance of the state helping them find the employment than me 200 miles away in Seattle. And then lastly, to refer to Dr. Wax's comment, there is a true disdain for hiring white workers, or maybe even those black workers from Seattle, or maybe black workers who are rioting in Charlotte, because they do prefer a certain ethnic group now. And that has to do also with whether it's the Hispanic that runs the work source, the state employment office in that little location, or just the local kind of a job guy that can round up his buddies to work. So there's some barriers here that suggest that this problem is even worse than the statistics that you have identified. And so thank you for your work.
Just to follow up on that, you mentioned the mobility. I think it really is an extremely important issue that we need sometimes to encourage people who are natives. They can actually move. I think Kevin Williamson actually is one of the people who made this point. That's right. You can move to where the jobs are. If that's where they are, and it is unfortunate that to sort of follow up on what Dr. Wax has been saying, that people can come from Honduras and Guatemala to find these jobs in the United States, but they can't come from Kentucky. So absolutely, mobility is a big issue, and as Dr. Wax said, I don't really have any problem with the fact that there really is a real difference in the time, the effort, and the skill level sometimes of natives compared to immigrants. I hear the same stories. I mean, I've talked to contractors myself. And it can be kind of revealing, because oftentimes contractors are not particularly political, especially the smaller time ones. They often don't even know what is politically incorrect to say, so you can really get have a fun conversation with them. And it's the same story. I mean, it's the same story that Dr. Wax said, that there was one guy in particular who said when guys around here started hiring illegal immigrants, I was against it. I thought it was completely wrong. This is what the contractor said. But then again, I realized something, which is that those workers were just a lot better from his perspective. And I said the normal things. I said, well, are you sure you're paying the natives enough and so on? And, maybe he's not. Maybe he's not. But, when you hear these stories over and over, there's definitely something to them. And that's why I think, as Charles said, the grand experiment can try to get at all of those things. Let's get at the root causes of this stuff and hopefully get people back into the mainstream the way they haven't been in a while.
Can I just say one thing? People will say, well, if the Hispanics are such great workers and the recent off-the-boat immigrants are, well, why don't we want them? And I think the answer is that it's very short-term thinking. If you look at the second generation, the third generation of Hispanics, they become more like Americans, and not in positive ways. And they also have very low educational completement. Their out-of-wedlock birth rate is skyrocketing. I mean, they are falling into the underclass. That is, the sort of long-term perspective, and why, and there's a whole cultural story here that we haven't even, talked about. They don't stay the way they are once they come to America.
She's got the microphone. There might be some.
With the panelists' comment, on the, I think there's a differential in the cost of living from an American citizen, native or naturalized, and illegal alien labor, because American citizen, their standard is having, following, living in a home, have a certain basic level of living standard that they expect is what is normal. And illegal alien workers might work, 8:15 to a two-bedroom home. And there's, they will put up, they don't have the similar costs that American citizens do, so they can work for less and make more profit. And I think perhaps, would you agree or disagree that this is also a reason where an American citizen will look at, well, this job pays this amount. Can I have a normal life earning, 10, 8, $12 an hour? And I think that might be a reason to say, does it make more sense for them to not take that job and look for a job that maybe pays $14, $16, $18 an hour, rather than immediately working at a $8 an hour job or a $10 an hour job, but knowing that they will not be able to pay their bills and feed their families if they have one?
I mean, immigrants certainly have a lower reservation wage than natives. I mean, it's just very clear. I mean, for all the reasons you've already mentioned. And I think it does get to the point about what kind of society do we want to have. And this is what Charles said about, what do we owe our fellow citizens? And I think it at minimum, it must be having a minimally first world standard of living. And if you have an open border situation, it's not often mentioned, but I think it's certainly quite true that the wage will fall to world levels, and I'm not sure that that's what we want as a society.
Let it be noted that Adam Smith himself referred to the definition of poverty relative to what is considered a decent standard within a society.
And, I think everything you say is an argument to limit low-wage immigration, right? Once again, not making $14 an hour, $12 an hour is idleness better. It really, has terribly corrosive effects in the short term and in the long term. But there's another piece to it, which is, what the expectations are and what expectations are reasonable. These are very culturally sensitive, and I think that there's, the elites encourage, I think, outsized and somewhat unrealistic expectations from very unskilled people, sometimes just because they're of lesser ability and not bookish, as John Derbyshire would say, but sometimes, really falling into idleness because the society as a whole lets them off the hook and gives them the message that this is okay. So there's a delicate balance here that we have to strike, to give a fairly decent life to these people, but also be economically realistic. It's not easy to get the sweet spot, I think.
How you guys doing? It's really a pleasure to be here. I'm actually a public policy intern at NAFSA, and love having these discussions. But I just had a few questions for each of you. A lot of the times when these conversations are had with some my classmates and I, or sometimes my professors, some of the things that come to my mind are what is American? That identity. Like, how did we get here? And it makes me ask, is anti-immigration American? Because essentially we're all immigrants in some sense. And to your question, when you were saying a measure of a society is how the society treats its lesser citizens, the question I would have to that is American poverty the same as global poverty? If you were to look at America in a vacuum and what is considered the class system, is that the same as what poverty is globally? And when has isolationism ever worked in world history? So those of you.
Well, it worked for decades.
I'm sorry, I have a lot of questions.
I mean, to use these labels, isolationism, anti-immigration, I don't think it's helpful at all. You know, there was a long period in the 20th century where immigration was at a minimum. You know, we may be a nation of immigrants, but we are a sovereign nation, and I actually think America First is a healthy principle. We cannot rescue the world. We, you know, don't have the same responsibility, as Charles says, to the, you know, the global poor as we do to our own, and I think that is a healthy principle. I think to abandon that principle is the road to perdition, right? And the road to extinction, really, as a nation. So I just question your premises. I think immigration has to be adjusted in a pragmatic way in response to the conditions that prevail. And I think right now the conditions are such that low-wage immigration is overall harmful to our nation.
I guess one thing I would say is that, as you probably know, right, there was World War I and then restrictive legislation in the 20s, and the foreign-born fraction of the U.S. population declined dramatically. So in the 40s, 50s, 60s, through the 70s. By 1970, less than 5% of the U.S. population was foreign-born. It had been almost 15% earlier in the century. You could argue that that is the period of time in which we created a middle-class society. America of 1914 was very different than America of 1970 in terms of the distribution of income, the home ownership rate, the distribution of wealth. It had become much more egalitarian in the context of low immigration. Since immigration has picked up since the 1970s and on to the 80s, 90s, and now we've seen a return to levels of inequality much more associated with the earlier period of high immigration. There's certainly evidence immigration plays a role in that, but other factors have clearly contributed as well. But it is certainly true that low immigration seems to have coincided with a period in American history with the creation of large middle class. But it does get to a key. You're certainly right. To be poor in a foreign country is worse than being poor in the United States in general by all kinds of measures. And then this raises the question of how many people to let in, right? You have always that famous conversation between Deng Xiaoping and Jimmy Carter when he said, "Look, you're not letting your people go. You're not letting your people go." And Deng Xiaoping said, "How many would you like? Would you like 20 million, 30 million, 40 million? Just let me know." And this gets to an important point. I think most people, though not all, some of Charles's libertarian allies say at the Cato Institute would say there should be no limit, and if it's 1 billion people who want to come over a decade, that's fine. But most people think we should limit it for a whole variety of reasons that seem like common sense. And if you're going to limit it, then you're going to have to enforce it. Because there's tendency is for many more people who want to come than above whatever limit we set. And we set it because we think it's in our interest. You don't want to go any longer? It's one more question? All right.
Who's the lucky person?
Who's that lucky person? Hasn't asked a question yet, I think it's in.
Question for Dr. Murray. You've said that on current demographic and electoral trends that the possibility of limited government, the odds are approaching zero. Is that also true of this grand experiment? And if so, if we arrive at your favored electoral outcome this season, is this all just a moot discussion?
My credentials do not include a very good track record on practical political prognostication. I am on record in 1992 telling the Middletown, Maryland Women's Republican Club there was no way Bill Clinton could possibly be elected President of the United States. And my predictions haven't gotten much better since then. However, I think probably restrictions on low-skill immigration is an idea whose time has come. And I don't put a lot of faith in Hillary Clinton's fidelity to whatever she's enunciating about her attitude toward immigration. The fact that Donald Trump has gotten the response he has cannot be lost upon Democratic politicians who want to have win governorships and senatorships and House of Representatives and things like that. There's just simply too obvious that there's out there a kind of sea change in the mood created by Donald Trump. And so I think actually probably there will be restrictions. Will there, if Hillary Clinton wins, will they be large or small? Will there be better enforcement of the border? I suspect so, but again, I'm not the right guy to ask.
Oh, one last question. Go ahead,
Yeah,
please.
so I had a last question. So, so Bob Putnam at Harvard has done good work on ethnic diversity, and Bill Easterly at NYU has done good work on ethno-linguistic fractionalization and its effect on social trust and social capital and rule of law, and sort of all sorts of other institutions that affect the quality of government and the quality of life in a country. And I wonder, do you think that there is a place in immigration policy for thinking about the effect of diversity on American institutions?
If you're asking, do I think that it's in the realm of possibility that we'll go back to the 1920s where we let in immigrants relative to the existing proportion of ethnic groupings or something like that? No, I don't think that's in the cards. I think the question you have just raised is absolutely central to all sorts of problems. For those of you who don't know, Bob Putnam first revealed what other people had found, but Bob Putnam made it well known that ethnic diversity is associated with really devastating effects on social trust, which also has devastating effects on social capital. And it's not just that the people in an ethnically diverse community don't trust each other, social trust within each ethnic group goes down. And this seems to be true across lots of different mixes of ethnic groups. And this is not a social science finding that has been taken on board by the mainstream media or by the rest of it. I know. You'll be glad to know some of us are going to be writing about this. Me, for example. But I doubt that this will get into the debate about immigration, and the reason being, let's say that Hillary Clinton is elected, but suppose she does say that she knows which way the wind is blowing and she does want to have some restrictions on immigration. She will be absolutely obsessed with framing these in a way which protect her from being called racist, protect her from all the things that would be raised if she makes any mention whatsoever of the social trust issue.
Well, listen, I'm going to cut it off there, but I want to thank you all for coming, and I especially want to thank our panelists for a really interesting discussion. Did you want to say one more thing, Jace?
Just before we go, I wanted to thank the CIS staff for putting this together. It was actually pretty fun seeing everybody come together. It looks like a simple thing to do, but it's really not to put a panel like this together. So thank you very much to the Center for Immigration Studies.
Well, thank you for writing the paper.